Shalom and welcome to the Jewish Geography Podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Eitan Levy, broadcasting to you from my home in Tekoa, in the Judean hills south of Jerusalem. Today I'm going to talk about Rabbinic authority and Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism is, for all intents and purposes, Judaism. It's what we refer to when we talk about Judaism today. Even if you are not an Orthodox Jew, many of the things that you do in your observance of Judaism, lighting Shabbat candles, the holiday of Hanukkah, and many other things like that, are of rabbinic origin. Rabbinic Judaism is Judaism, but what is the rabbinic part of it exactly? How does it work? And what is rabbinic authority? Where do rabbis get any authority to say anything to us that we're supposed to listen to them? These are good questions, important questions, and they're questions that a lot of people, including a lot of Orthodox Jews, have about Judaism. So today I'm going to launch full steam ahead into the question of rabbinic authority, and hopefully this will clear up a lot of questions for a lot of people. Today, for the first time, I'm also going to put together a few different segments. So after the section about rabbinic authority, there's going to be a little bit of talk about news and a new installment of Happy Hour at the end. So please stay tuned for the whole thing, and I hope you enjoy. Let's go. How do rabbinic tradition and rabbinic authority work practically? And why do Orthodox Jews put so much stock in rabbinic authority? So there's a lot of confusion out there about how Rabbinic Judaism works. I explained in the first podcast in this series that the oral tradition was eventually written down by the rabbis in the form of the Mishnah and the Talmud. But I didn't go in depth there about where that oral tradition came from, how it's used, and why we follow it. Let's talk about that now. In Jewish tradition, we believe that God essentially handed down two things at Mount Sinai. One was the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, or at least most of it. The last few verses may have been added by Joshua following divine commands. If all we had was the written word, there would be a serious problem. The text is not always completely clear. 10 people reading the same words could interpret it in 10 wildly different ways, leading to 10 different religions instead of one community, one nation, united in their service of the Creator. For example, let's take the Sabbath, Shabbat. There is a separate commandment not to make a fire on the Sabbath, but the general prohibition on doing work on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, says, V'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha lo taseh kol melacha, and the 7th day shall be a Sabbath for the Lord your God. You shall do no malacha. Malacha is the word often translated as work, but that's not accurate. There's another word in Hebrew which means work. The word is avodah. Malacha is a word that's a bit harder to translate. So in any case, let's say we do translate it as something like work. What does it mean to not do work? Does that mean the stuff you do for money? What if you don't work? What if you're a housewife or a trust fund kid? Do you do nothing different on the Sabbath? Does it mean just lighting a fire, which, as I said, is mentioned explicitly in another line in the Bible? So I can go to work as long as I don't light a fire? Is it okay to leave a fire lit to keep my food warm? Or do we have to not use a fire, even if lit before Shabbat starts? You can see how this would get confusing, right? God, of course, understood that the written Torah was not a precise and flexible enough guide to life all on its own. It needs some explanation. So he also explained to Moses how to read and interpret the text. He told him what the laws meant and gave him some exegetical tools, that is, tools for how to read and interpret the text in the future when questions might come up. Why give this law orally and not write it down immediately? Well, law is a funny thing. You need it to be precise and predictable enough that you know what to do, but you need it to be flexible enough with enough interpretational leeway to apply it to new and different circumstances. The Torah is certainly eternal, according to our tradition, but the situations we find ourselves in change all the time. Ideally, our leaders would be faithful to the traditions, but be allowed some limited leeway in applying them. If we wrote them down, there is a danger of the law becoming too inflexible. For over 1,500 years, the oral law was kept strictly oral, handed down from teacher to student in an uninterrupted chain of transmission. We even have a record of that chain of transmission in the Mishnah of the Fathers, otherwise known as Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, which reads, Moshe received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things: be deliberate in judgment and establish many students and make a fence for the Torah. Shimon the righteous was of the last of the great assembly. He would say, on 3 things the world stands: on the Torah, on the service, that is the service of God, and on acts of kindness. The Mishnah continues on in the same vein until the time when the oral tradition was written down around 200 CE. It gives us the chain of transmission and a characteristic teaching from each succeeding generation of scholars. So we have a chain of transmission directly connecting the written tradition we have all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai. That's where the rabbinic tradition claims its legitimacy from. Sometimes people like to draw a bright line between the Torah and the rabbinic traditions. This one I follow and this one I don't, this one I believe in, this one I don't. But if you believe in the Torah, that it's true because your rabbis told you so, I don't really see why one would not also believe them about the rabbinic tradition. But in any case, that's another question. This is the claim that rabbinic Judaism makes. But really, when we talk about the oral tradition, we have to use scare quotes, right? Oral. I mean, it was written down almost 2,000 years ago, right? After the Romans put down 2 massive rebellions and suppressed Judaism in the land of Israel, the leading rabbis were afraid that the traditions would get lost and the chain of transmission broken. So Rabbi Judah the Prince, which is an honorary title for the head of the Sanhedrin, the main Jewish court, collected and edited the existing traditions into a work called the Mishnah. But since the oral tradition wasn't supposed to be written down, he wrote as little as possible. In fact, he was so succinct, some might say cryptic, that after a couple of generations, people were arguing about what he meant exactly. So a huge collection of commentaries explaining the Mishnah was compiled, and that came to be called the Gemara, and they were thenceforth published together in the volumes of the Talmud, which is the basic study material in rabbinic academies, yeshivot, until today. So how did the rabbis know what was forbidden on Shabbat? We're going to examine this as one example of how rabbinic exegesis works. First, let's look in the Mishnah. That is the first part of the oral law that was written down by Judah the Prince. The Mishnah of Shabbat, chapter 7, section 2. The number of principal malachot is 40 minus 1. The forbidden malachot are sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, sorting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, whitening it, combing it, dyeing it, spinning, weaving, making 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads, tying a knot, untying a knot, sewing 2 stitches, tearing for the purpose of sewing 2 stitches, hunting a deer, slaughtering it, skinning it, salting it, curing its hide, scraping it, cutting it, writing 2 letters, erasing for the purpose of writing 2 letters, building, demolishing, extinguishing a flame, lighting a flame, striking with a hammer, carrying from one domain to another. These are the principal malachot. They are 40 minus 1. End quote. That is 40 minus 1 equals 39. But whoa. Where are we getting this all from, right? I quoted the line from the Torah earlier. It just says, don't do malacha. Where are we getting this all from? When the rabbis wrote down the Mishnah, everybody knew where these categories of work were derived from, so they didn't bother writing it down in the Mishnah. They were just writing down the precise categories to make sure people wouldn't forget. They were writing down the Cliff's Notes. It took a couple more generations until people started to argue about where these categories came from. Then they wrote it down in the Gemara. This is a Shabbat 92 Aleph, in case anyone wants to follow the source. They learned from a series of exegesis that the word malacha is also used in the Bible to describe building the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And in the description of building the tabernacle, they describe 39 types of actions. So those 39 types of actions are what are forbidden on Shabbat. So, for example, since making a furrow in the ground, like one does when plowing, is one of the types of actions that are forbidden, we have to figure out how to apply it in other circumstances. What counts as making a furrow? What doesn't count? The rabbis use the oral tradition and their interpretive powers to spell it out in precise detail. That's how we get the laws of Shabbat as we have them today. And although that gives us all the laws, we still have new questions all the time because new situations come up. So over the centuries, various rabbis wrote letters called responsa because they're usually in response to a question from a Jewish person who's wondering how to deal with this new situation. These letters are called responsa to various questions of how to apply Jewish law to modern issues and in a contemporary context. For instance, when electricity came around, they had to figure out how it fit into the categories we already had. Is it permitted or forbidden on Shabbat? If it's forbidden, why? Is it like fire? Or is completing the circuit one of the forbidden acts somehow? Rabbis today, like me, we have to master all this material to be able to give rulings in Jewish law. Since there's so much of it, most of us have areas of specialty and areas where we know the basics and ask the hard questions to a specialist in that area called a posek. And that's how we get down from the Bible and the oral tradition given to Moses at Mount Sinai to the rabbis of today. And I hope this clears up for a lot of people what exactly is meant by rabbinic authority, how it functions, and where that authority comes from. Are you thinking of coming to Israel? If so, go ahead, check out my website, rabbieitan.com. I've got all sorts of information on there, tours, packages, fun things to do, of course, the places where you can listen to and subscribe to this podcast, and lots of different ways to get in touch with me and start thinking about what you'd like to do when you're here. I'm a tour guide, and I love to take people around the land of Israel, show off the people of Israel, the land of Israel, the Torah of Israel. So if you're thinking about it, and you should be thinking about it, go ahead, take a look. And now, let's hear some news. My Facebook feed is crowded these days with posts for and against accepting Syrian refugees, both in Europe and in the US. I can't help but be appalled by the simplistic rhetoric on both sides. One side just assumes all Arabs are bad, and the other calls that side Nazis, basically, or at least implies it. Neither side approaches the truth. While we must learn from history, we also need to recognize that every situation is different. I don't know much about the Muslim community in the US, so I'll have to plead ignorance, but in Europe, at least, it has become a breeding ground for terrorists. It is not unreasonable to think that doubling that population will also increase not only the number of terrorists overall, but the ease of operation they will enjoy by having a larger sympathetic population to hide in. I don't think France and Belgium's radicalized Muslims will magically want to become westernized because we were nice and let their cousins from Syria in. And they are more likely to pull the new immigrants into their orbit, their radicalized orbit, than the other way around. Of course, most Muslims are not terrorists, but as shown in every poll on the subject, a significant minority, and in some places even a majority, passively support terrorism. To take the analogy of World War II and the Western nations not allowing Jews into the country, it would be like if they had good polling data that 30% of Jews in Europe supported the random mass murder of Americans. Of course, only 1% would actually be the murderers, but
the U.S. would have then been perfectly reasonable to deny entry to Jewish refugees. But it's also not an either-or situation, thank God, if we assume that the situation in Syria is not going to last forever, and especially if we actually do something to make that be the case. We could put billions of dollars into housing them in tent city refugee camps in Turkey and Jordan, or even in small safe zones we could create in Syria itself, and then billions more into repatriating them to their home country after the conflict is over. Of course, that would be an eventuality that we would have to help come about. It would still cost less than accepting them as citizens in the West, and be less dangerous. The amount of self-involved myopia the West is showing by only getting upset about the refugees now is just astounding to me. Where were the Europeans when 5,000 Yazidi men and older women were being genocidally massacred a year ago, and thousands of young women taken as slaves, where they're still living in captivity today? We gave a trickle of guns to the Kurds, but not enough to save them. No airlifts, no Facebook battle of opinion over it, just mostly silence and a few news articles reporting what was going on. I'm not advocating ignoring the refugees. I'm advocating taking more responsibility for the situation, not less. Of course, this would actually require planning and forethought, instead of just bumbling through as the situation arises. The EU sucks at that. And it seems to me the only reason this hasn't been brought up as a possible solution is because nobody is willing to get involved seriously in the fight against Islamic terror. We would rather coddle Iran, drop a few bombs on the Islamic State, and let the bloodbath between the dark-skinned Middle Easterners continue. That is the real shame. The most humane solution is one that helps the innocent from one conflict without endangering people in another country by importing partisans of that conflict. We can do both. Just look at the beautiful tent cities the Saudis put up for the Hajj, with air conditioning, for God's sake, to house millions of people. Every year, the West is so rich and technology so advanced, all that is lacking is will. And now, we're going to lighten up the mood a little bit and go right into happy hour. Enjoy. Welcome to Happy Hour on the Jewish Geography Podcast. On Friday, 2 weeks ago, Rabbi Yaakov Littman from Kiryat Arba was on his way to the Shabbat Chatan of his daughter's fiancé. Traditionally, this is a celebration where the groom and his friends get together the Shabbat before the wedding. The bride has a separate celebration with her friends, and the two don't see each other for the week before the wedding. The car was full of 7 family members on their way to Meital for the celebration. Terrorists opened fire on the car, killing Rabbi Littman and his 18-year-old son Natanel. Suddenly, the wedding, which was going to be 3 days later, had to be postponed. Now, Rabbi Littman's daughter, Sarah Tchia Littman, and her soon-to-be husband Ariel Bigel have rescheduled the wedding for only a bit more than a week later, this coming Thursday, November 26th. I think our great enemy, Ismail Haniyeh, head of Hamas, puts the difference between the terrorists and the Jews the best. He said, "We are going to win because they love life and we love death." As my wife Daniela says, may we both get what we desire. So you're probably asking, what's the happy part of this? What is the Jewish answer to death and destruction? So the answer is to live life ecstatically, joyfully, and with gusto, to marry and have children and sing and dance and drink and eat and love. So, in the best tradition of Jewish defiance, of light in the face of darkness, life in the face of death, Sarah and Ariel put out this invitation to their wedding at 10:30 p.m. this Thursday. That's November 26th. They wrote, "Don't make our enemies happy. We fell, we got up. With God's help, our wedding will take place next Thursday, 26 November, 14th Kislev at Binyanei Ha'umah in Jerusalem. Am Yisrael is invited to get up from the dust and rejoice with us." Signed, Sarah Tchia and Ariel. So that's this Thursday, November 26th at the Jerusalem Convention Center called Binyanei Ha'umah. Be there or be square. The entire Jewish people is invited. I can't imagine a better way to fight back, to show what it is that makes the Jewish people darn near indestructible, our deep love and clinging to life, than answering a murder with a wedding, the founding of a new Jewish home in Israel that will, please God in time, be the foundation for the next generation of Jewish life. And in the merit of these two brave young people, may we merit to see the final redemption, peace for all peoples, and a time when Jerusalem will live up to its promise as a house of prayer for all nations. Can I get an amen? And that's it for this episode of the Jewish Geography Podcast. If you enjoyed it, if you want to hear more, please go on to the website, rabbiaton.com, and podcast link up at the top of the page. You'll find all sorts of different ways to listen, to subscribe. You can search for Jewish Geography on the iTunes store. And please, if you're enjoying the show, go ahead onto iTunes and leave a good review, leave a 5-star rating, or I hope you'll leave a 5-star rating anyway. It really helps get the podcast out to more people. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.